Right. Hello. Good morning. Tēnā katoa. A few little short messages. Welcome to the last lecture on H2O. A reminder, there'll be no meeting next Friday, and we've only got one that week off, and then we're back into the potpourri series to conclude the year. Only one day off. The AGM will be before the second potpourri lecture. That is on November the 4th. I think it starts, we have that AGM starting at, help me please, 9:30? Thanks. Regarding the new interest groups, I'm delighted to say that we've got a convener for the book group. I have a minor problem that we need to have an inaugural meeting, and I need to get in touch with those 9 people who wish to join that group, and would they please, those people please send me an email, so I've got everyone's email address and can sort of tell them the day of the inaugural meeting or the evening of the inaugural meeting. That's for the new book group, and I would request please those people who put their names down for the new interest groups, please have a think about whether you'd like to put your hand up to be a convener. Thank you. Emma's given me a flyer for a concert, St Christopher's fundraiser concert, which will be on the Saturday the 22nd of October here. There's a flyer, they're out in the foyer there. So anyone interested in going to that? I think that's all the messages. So, thank you, Joan. Would you care to introduce our speaker, please?
I'd like to introduce Helen Beaumont, who will be our speaker today. I'll just read out her bio. I am an environmental chemist by training. My early career was with DSIR and then ESR, a Crown Research Institute. I began in basic and applied research and then moved into the commercial laboratory arm, applying science in the marketplace. I then moved onto policy work and had the privilege of working as Assistant Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment for 7 years. I was appointed to the Environment Court in 2007 and served a 5-year term as a Commissioner. I moved to Christchurch following the earthquakes, attracted by the exciting job of rebuilding a city. I have worked for the City Council since 2013, starting in the Policy and Planning Group and moving to my current role as Head of Three Waters in May 2019. So if you'd like to come up now, thank you.
I'm not very tall, so I will stand right on the top for you as well. So thanks for the invitation. It's always a privilege, actually, to give a presentation to University of the Third Age. I think you are the best audience. I talk to a lot of groups, and some of the community meetings are not so friendly, I have to say. Now, I had a look at your previous talks on water, and most of them have been about water as a resource. And most of what I want to talk to today and what the reform is aimed at is water services. So how we use that water and then hopefully dispose of it properly back into the environment. So I'll talk first of all about the importance of water, and of course fresh drinking water and the good disposal of wastewater is fundamental to public health. So water services are fundamental to the running of our society and the businesses that all depend on it. And the third water in the three waters, of course, is stormwater, and that overlaps a little bit with flood protection, floodplain management. So our health and our prosperity depend on these three water services. And indeed, we usually take them for granted. And in the developed world, so you should. You don't think about whether or not water's going to come out of your tap in the morning, well, unless we're repairing a water main in your street. But generally speaking, you can rely on that. And similarly, you can flush the toilet and it'll reliably go away. I only get in the news when that's not happening. But I want to talk a little bit about how big that business is. So wastewater in Christchurch, our assets in wastewater total 5 billion. I mean, we blow Metro Sports, the art gallery, even the new stadium out of the water. This is a big business. And we spend an enormous amount keeping that big business running. So we invest 70 million capital each year on average in our wastewater network. So we have this 2,000 kilometres of mains, 1,000 kilometres of laterals just to get to and from each household, 28,000 manholes. You'll know some of those when you drive over them. There's 14,000 tanks and chambers associated with the wastewater system. A lot of those are not out this side of town, they're out on the east side of town where we've got vacuum and pressure systems, because following the earthquakes, the traditional gravity sewers would not work. Now, the water table's too high, the ground's too unstable. So a lot of those little tanks and chambers are out there. 150 pump stations right across the city, and another 84 lift stations, and that's because we're so damned flat. So running a gravity system, if it runs down, it soon gets pretty deep, and so you've got to lift it up to run it down again and get it all the way from the western side of the city over to the east where our treatment plant is. We have a number of odour control sites across the city, and that's simply because the wastewater's going so far, it gets anaerobic and pretty smelly pretty quickly. So we have to control the odour in those mains, and also control hydrogen sulphide, which corrodes our mains. 8 treatment plants, 1 here and the others out on Banks Peninsula, and a couple of land irrigation schemes. In terms of that annual capital spend, the vast majority of it is just on renewals, and the vast majority of those are on the mains. That's why we're always digging up your roads. So, and then some on improvements and some on growth. Similarly in water supply, again, the network is worth 2.9 billion. So it's a big network, and we have some 3,000 kilometres of mains and sub-mains, a couple of hundred kilometres of laterals, a vast number of hydrants, those meters that you all love, 170 wells, that's about 140 in the city and some across on Banks Peninsula, pumps, pump stations, reservoirs, tanks. Most of our reservoirs, of course, cross the hills so that we can maintain pressure in the hill suburbs. And again, we spend about 74 million a year maintaining that network. Most of it on renewals, some on improvements, and some on growth. The water metering, which no doubt I'll get some questions about, and the excess water use charge, is actually aimed at that growth component, because we've actually got plenty of water if we just wouldn't use so much in the summer. So our network is built for the hottest hour of the hottest summer day after 2 weeks of dry weather, when everybody turns their sprinkler on. And it's an absurd way to run a network, I have to say, and costs us a lot more than it should if we could just get that summer demand back under control. Stormwater and floodplain management. So Christchurch is unusual in that we, as a city, look after our floodplain, and that is, we look after the flooding from the rivers. And usually that's a regional council function, and in most of the country the regional councils do it. But here, because we came from the Christchurch Drainage Board, all of the Christchurch Drainage Board functions moved across to the city rather than being split, and some go across to the regional council. So we also look after flooding. So this is open waterways, underground pipes, pump stations again, 227 basins. So we have almost 300 hectares of basins and wetlands to try and manage stormwater across the city. So that's almost twice the size of Hagley Park around the city. And some of you may have seen the new ones up on the top of the Heathcote, which are absolutely fantastic. in terms of both a recreational resource, ecological improvement, mahinga kai. They're multi-use facilities. They don't just look after stormwater. So it's a great way of managing the stormwater challenge in the city. In terms of, again, we've got all those manholes, sumps, outlets, valves to look after, and 70 monitoring sites, so across our rivers and streams, to keep an eye on water levels, but also on water quality. The network assets here are a little less, 2.1 billion, because we don't have treatment plants as such. Most of it's blue-green infrastructure. And the capital spend, about 51 million. A lot more on improvements and growth, so less on renewals. So you don't have to renew your stormwater basins in the same way you have to renew your pipes and treatment plants. You do have to maintain them, but not so much the renewals. And the 50% growth is, of course, the growth of the city. So the growth of the city, and whenever we work with developers, we often add treatment for other parts of the city. So where there's growth in the southwest of the city, and like the new growth right across Wigram, we will add treatment facilities, and then the neighbouring suburbs' stormwater is brought in through those treatment facilities to improve it before it goes into the rivers. So we work closely with developers there. Now, in terms of water reform and the government perspective on the challenges, what we do here as a team for Christchurch City is done by 67 individual local authorities. Most of those are small, so we're big. I've got a team of almost 200 people, and there's probably another 200 in our maintenance contractor, and probably another 200 across the capital program. So we've got a lot of people. And some small councils, they've got 3 who look after their water networks. So they don't have the depth of expertise or the ability to respond to issues and problems in their networks. So complying with drinking water safety standards and environmental expectations is a huge challenge, particularly for those smaller councils. Funding infrastructure deficits, similarly a huge challenge. So we had huge growth in this country in the 50s and 60s, and all of that infrastructure is now coming around for renewals. And here in Christchurch, of course, we gave it a good shake through the earthquakes, so some of it's coming faster than it would have otherwise. One of the other issues that the water reform is targeting is the lack of effective regulation and enforcement of the regulation that was there. And that is partly because it's dispersed across the country, across the regional councils for environmental discharges, and partly because they lost faith in the Ministry of Health and the enforcement of the drinking water regulations following Havelock North. And we can talk a little bit more about that. There's also a complete lack of economic regulation in this space. So there's no one looking over my shoulder, for example, or the City Council's shoulder, as to whether or not we are being fair and effective in the way we charge you for your water, wastewater, stormwater, or whether or not we're actually investing enough in that water and wastewater network and not putting a burden on future generations. So there's no economic regulation in there at all. And there's a future challenge in terms of natural hazards, particularly with climate change. And that's particularly in the stormwater and flood protection space, but also affects drinking water supplies. So on Banks Peninsula, for example, we always have trouble in the summer getting enough water out of the streams over there and trying to squeeze enough out of the sort of meagre aquifers they have compared to what we have under the city. And that's predicted to get worse with climate change, so more drought and more difficulty in getting water for those. One of the other challenges is, I touched on a little bit, is incident response, and nobody will forget the fire at the wastewater treatment plant. I certainly won't. So my treatment plant operator was on the phone as this was happening and said to me, "Helen, we've got a fire. It's the roof of the trickling filter." I said, and he was running with his team to get out. And he said, "It's okay, it's only one." And then he said, "Oops." And they shared an air handling system, so it went across the air handling system and across, and the roof of the other one went up. And we've done a lot of work and finally have an activated sludge plant running in the interim. We've converted parts of the plant to put this in place and no longer have the stink coming across the city. I suspect most of you live out the west side, but if any of you are unfortunate enough to live out east, you would have been very familiar with the smell that was coming. So every time we had an easterly, those eastern suburbs really copped it, and it was pretty bad. In the drinking water network, the biggest issue and sort of incident is around what happened in Havelock North, and then the knock-on effects across the country, particularly here in Christchurch, where we were required to add chlorine to the supply, where we never had to before. So Havelock North, back in August 2016, 5,500 people got sick out of a population of only 14,000 people. So most of the town was affected, and it contributed to the death of 3 people. So those were 3 people who were unwell with other conditions, but even so, it contributed to those deaths. And there were a couple of inquiries, and it's the Stage 2 report in December 2017 that had a number of recommendations. One of them was abolishing the secure classification system for groundwater, and that was important for us. Because we had secure classification for our groundwater, that is, it's not subject to influences from the surface, and we can rely on it being pure and clean, we didn't have to use chlorine, and they recommended abolishing that and making us encouraging or mandating universal treatment of supplies. They also recommended establishing a single drinking water regulator, and that was because the Ministry of Health drinking water assessors were aware of issues in Havelock North and were working in a friendly and encouraging way with the council rather than telling them to get their act together when clearly they needed to. It had been going on for too long. So they had seen issues with that supply in the past and they hadn't addressed them. So the council hadn't addressed them and the drinking water assessor hadn't sort of given them a good lashing and make them. There's also a review of the drinking water standards, which is mostly technical, but also this creation of dedicated aggregated drinking water suppliers. So Havelock North was supplied from Hastings. Hastings, well, not a tiny council, was still quite a small council and had a very small team. So they didn't have, they probably would have had one person who was looking after drinking water in terms of operations, investment, as well as quality and compliance. I'm lucky enough to have 12 people in my quality and compliance team. So, there's a depth of expertise there and a thoroughness of monitoring that these other suppliers don't have. And then a review of water safety plans. And that's one of the things that's led to chlorine being in our supply for much longer than we originally anticipated. The Director General's statement telling all councils to reconsider reliance on secure bore water status, that was aimed at us, a number of other suppliers in South Canterbury, and Napier and Lower Hutt. So there's only a small number of suppliers across the country with those secure bore status. And finally, just talk a little bit about the third water. So stormwater and flood protection. Now stormwater, again, generally runs under the radar. People don't notice the stormwater system until it doesn't cope. And it doesn't cope with very heavy rain events. So water on the roads we regard as good flooding, just by the way, good flooding. Our roads are designed as secondary flow paths. So the stormwater system itself, those gutters and drains you see on the road, in older parts of the city, it's only designed for a 5 or 10 year return period storm. So it's those small frequent storms that we see from time to time. It's not designed to take, this was a 20-year storm back in July this year. So the stormwater network is not designed for those bigger storms, and that's why we have to build areas like this that hold the water in the top of the catchments and then bring it down slowly into the rivers so you don't get those rivers and drains overflowing. But you will get still water running along the roads. And the other reason for that facility there, which is usually a park where people walk their dogs or play ball, is you can see that the water is really brown, so it holds the water and drops out a lot of that sediment again before it goes into the Heathcote and ruins the water quality in there. Okay, so just talk a little bit more about money. So we've talked about what our network's worth and what we spend on it, but if you multiply that up across the nation, we're talking about a lot of money. So council spend before this current LTP, so this is a little bit out of date, but for good reason, was around 40 billion across the country on our Three Waters network infrastructure. After all of this talk about water reform, the next rounds of LTPs right across the country doubled that. So all of the councils actually took notice of what happened in Havelock North, of what was happening in Wellington as they were blowing mains and sewers with monotonous regularity. They doubled the spend in their LTPs, so that's the 10-year spend up to 80 million. However, the conservative estimate of what we need to spend is up at around 120 million, and the high estimate could be up to 180 million. So there's an enormous amount of deferred investment, if you like, in our infrastructure. And there are reasons for this, understandable reasons. One is, I have yet to be called to a council meeting to listen to a petition for someone asking for a better sewer in their street. My colleagues often get called to council meetings because there's petitions about potholes, or petitions about better library facilities, or petitions about the local swimming pool. But you don't get the neighbourhoods and the citizens calling for better sewers. You just don't get it. So it's not an investment that councillors are going to run their election campaign on, generally speaking. Although they have talked a bit about Three Waters in this last one. So it's a hidden investment. It's not something that you can cut ribbons on. In terms of your dollar, just coming back a little bit, so we spend a lot of money on our capital program, but we also spend a lot of money on our operational program. So for every dollar in rates you pay, almost 25 cents, almost a quarter of it comes into Three Waters. So we do spend a lot of money, more than any other sort of unit in the city. So the only ones who come close are roading and footpath, who spend about 13 cents of that dollar. Community and citizens, that's all of your libraries, all of your swimming pools, your art gallery, all of those community facilities, which in a city the size of Christchurch are critical to wellbeing. And we of course also share those facilities with neighbouring councils. If you look at small councils, their spend is quite different. The 21 or 25% for Three Waters is more likely to be about 60% of their spend because they don't have the other extensive community facilities, and often people use their neighbouring cities for those. So it's a different cut. So if you take Three Waters out of the Christchurch City Council, there's still a lot of Christchurch City Council left. If you take Three Waters out of some of the smaller districts, Otrahonga district, there's not much left behind. One of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about was renewals compared to depreciation. You don't have to understand this graph very much really, except to, we've got the years along the bottom. The orange represents how much we invested in renewals, and the blue represents how much the network is depreciating. The orange and blue should be the same height, okay, if you're maintaining your network, more or less. Before 2021, you can see that the orange is about half of the blue. So we were massively under-investing in renewals. And that was actually true all the way back to just after the earthquakes. So after the earthquakes, there was a massive investment from the SCIRT program. So the SCIRT Alliance did all the earthquake repairs and replacements, spent billions on the wastewater system, millions on the water supply system, and very little on the stormwater system. Okay, so that was the split. So the wastewater network got most of the money, the water supply network got some of it, and most of it was spent out east, where most of the damage was done. So out east, actually, some of our infrastructure is in better nick because of this. And then, because the city had so much to do across all of its assets, it decided to sweat the Three Waters assets. And it reduced the renewals dramatically and said, we've got all the post-earthquake investment, they'll be fine. Reduced the program, and we just did the very high priority work. And now we're playing catch up. So our investment profile now is jumping up, and we're trying to play catch up. It's still not quite meeting depreciation, but at least we're getting all of the high priority work done at the moment. The result of that is just the water loss figures from our network. This is not private side, just the public side of the network. So generally speaking, the water loss across the Christchurch network has run at about probably 15-16%. Then after the earthquakes, it jumped massively to 25% because of the breaks in the mains. The skirt work dropped that back down to the 15-16%, but it's been climbing every year since. And this graph actually only goes up to 2019, but it's climbed the next 2 years as well. So we're still playing catch up on repairing our network. And most of this is the old asbestos cement mains, which when you shake them, you get lots of little micro cracks in them and become more fragile, so we get leaks coming out of them, and we get those spectacular mains breaks that you occasionally see on the news. So back to the reforms and that regulatory environment. So public health is paramount in the mind of central government, particularly following Havelock North, not only because of the impact on that community, but also the impact on New Zealand as a safe place to visit and a safe place to live and work. So that regulatory regime was first changed by the Ministry of Health themselves, and they tightened up the water safety plans, introduced new risk frameworks and higher requirements for data and reporting. We revised our own water safety plan under that, and that was what was behind my comment about the chlorine being there for longer. So the first driver for chlorine was the below ground wellheads. So the wells come up, and most of our wells had a wellhead that was below ground and often under a plate, and then it went straight into the water network or sometimes into a tank in a pump station, but often just straight into the water network. All of those had to be raised above ground, and you'll see them all around town. They're nice blue in a cage, and all those wellheads are now above the ground and not subject to water, of course, going into that chamber and then going down the side of the well and possibly contaminating it. But as well as the below ground wellheads, we identified backflow as a risk to our network, and backflow is when, particularly for an industrial connection, when you have a water supply connection into a factory, something goes wrong on the factory side and the pressure is higher and they push contaminants back into the water supply system. Particularly bad if that factory also has sewage or other sorts of contaminants like that, but also food manufacturing and other factories, and also chemicals, that's the other thing. So the backflow risk that was previously considered acceptable was now deemed unacceptable, and again you may see outside a lot of commercial premises a little pipe that comes out of the ground, up, over, and then back in to feed the factory, and there's a backflow device in there that stops any water going back into our network. And you'll be pleased to know that all commercial premises have to pay for that. We offer to put it in for them, we're very kind, and then charge them. So most of them have been happy to do that, because if they do it themselves, they have to get a building consent, and that's a real pain. So we're doing that. And then Taumata Arawai, the new water services regulator, has been put in place, and they're busy putting out new rules and new standards. So new rules and standards have come out. And for us, because we've tried to keep one step ahead, we are one step ahead of those rules and standards, but it does mean a lot more monitoring and reporting to them. Water reform, the other recommendation that came out was aggregated water providers. And when the government first came out, it talked about a regional model, so going with the regional council type boundaries and having about 12 or 14 of these units. It's sometimes called the Super Rugby model, actually, that one. And then a smaller number of regional publicly owned. Christchurch City Council, of course, with all the other councils, got involved and participated in the discussions around reform. We also took the money. So there was a memorandum of understanding offered to all councils back in 2020, and essentially that said, if you play nicely and talk to us and give us your data, we'll give you money. Okay. So we got 40 million in stimulus funding, and we spent all that by June 2022. The vast majority of it on mains renewals, so some of that deficit, in the water mains, but a lot of it also on deferred maintenance of our pump stations. You probably don't notice our pump stations, but they were looking pretty scruffy. So we did a whole lot of work on those, tidied them up, fixed all the broken windows, doors, tidied up all the things inside and painted them. So people were proud to work in them rather than embarrassed and ashamed, which we were. We provided a lot of information about our systems, so the detailed financial and performance information, and all of the other councils around the country did as well. The Mayor was on, previous Mayor, not the Mayor-elect, previous Mayor was on the governance working group and recommended a number of changes to the governance structure and the shareholding, mostly to simplify it. The first model that came out was horrendously complicated with about 3 layers of governance before you got to the people who were doing the work. And my team and other teams from across council have been on various working groups since. So looking at getting good asset information. We have pretty good asset information. Some small councils have almost none, so they don't know what's in the ground. And they don't have any systems for keeping track of that. It might be in a spreadsheet at best. Also information on operations, particularly on the compliance of those operations. So do we have a consent for all of our discharges? Are we complying with that consent? That sort of work. We've done a lot of work on retaining talent. So that is keeping the staff that we've got and attracting new staff, because whenever you have reform and change, people get unsettled and they think, oh, I don't know if this is going to continue, I'll go and work somewhere else. So we've done quite a lot of work in that space. And a lot of information on our information technology and our operating technology. The information technology, just our underlying financial systems, all the systems you use in any business. And our operating technology is all of the remote sensing and control systems that we have for our networks. So there's a lot of that. And it's different in every council around the country. So there's a bit of work to be done. This council has made recommendations to government and to the Select Committee hearing a number of bills. Most of that has been around pausing the program. And part of that is to understand what the impact of this is going to be on local government. When I talked about the small councils, where you take 60% of the work off them, is it a viable organisation left behind? And how does it link into the other review that's going on at the moment, the Future for Local Government, which central government unfortunately called Future of Local Government to start with, and then realised their mistake. Future for Local Government. So that needs to be better integrated with what they're planning for Three Waters, and also integrated with the new legislation that's coming in around resource management and climate change adaptation, because they're all linked. In particular, this council doesn't agree that there's a case for change for stormwater and flood management. Stormwater and flood management are very different to the other two waters. It's an open system. It includes the natural waterways, it includes our roading system, it includes a lot of our parks. Drinking water and wastewater, you want them contained in their pipes. Stormwater, you actually want to use the natural lay of the land, and you want to control the use of that land to get the best outcomes for stormwater. In terms of progressing water reform, this council asked for a review of an alternative of just two waters, and also a review of the size of the entities. And then there are some detailed recommendations that were in that. From the government's perspective, the Three Waters program has these three pillars. There's the regulation, the reforms for establishing the service delivery, and then the economic regulator, and there'll be a customer, like an ombudsman in there as well. So there's all of those things running, and I'll whip through these pretty quickly. The aggregation of delivery, they've now settled on 4 water services entities, and we're part of Entity D, or Southern Waters. It doesn't have a real name yet, and it generally follows the Ngāi Tahu Takiwa. So the boundary of it is the Ngāi Tahu Takiwa. And we are about half the population of that. So the population is a little over 800,000, and half of that is Christchurch district. The average cost per household they've modelled under this for Entity A, which is Auckland and North, as $800 per annum. For Entity B and C, it's around 1,200 per annum, and for entity D, it's around 1,600 per annum. And the reason for that is just how distributed those networks are. So the population density up in the north of the North Island is much, much higher than it is here, and so it doesn't cost as much to deliver the services. It's also more concentrated, so you don't have as many small treatment plants and small systems to look after as you do way down south. Aims of the reforms, so they're multifaceted. The first one always is that public health one and community wellbeing. Secondly, better environmental outcomes. So in some parts of the city, we're still dropping raw sewage into rivers or into the coast. Not some parts of the city, some parts of New Zealand. We don't do it here. Economic growth and employment. So at the moment, the Three Waters workforce across the nation is about 5,000. They think that'll go up to around 8,000 or 9,000. So they see enormous growth in the workforce to deliver both the investment that's needed, but also the improvement in the monitoring and the quality side of Three Waters. It supports housing and urban development, of course, and you may have read in the papers there's been quite a bit of government money around for investment in this, and Lower Hutt just picked up several million for stormwater work so that they can put more housing in the Hutt River in the valley in there. Adapting to the impacts of climate change is a biggie for us. So as a low-lying coastal city, we are incredibly vulnerable to climate change. We're already vulnerable to coastal hazards, and it's just going to get worse and worse across the eastern side of the city. So there's a lot of work in there, and there's a lot of work in there whether we dig in and put in flood protection, coastal protection, much more robust infrastructure because it's constantly being drowned in seawater as the groundwater table comes up and down, or if we retreat in some sort of managed way, and often by event, as we did with the red zone. So the red zone, following the earthquakes, there was a massive retreat out of there. Matata, following that debris flow, there was a retreat out of there. And I suspect that in the future, going forward in our coastal areas, that's how it'll work, that we'll zone areas that are at high hazard, and after an event, people won't be allowed to go back. They'll be paid out their EQC and told, go find somewhere else to live. Won't be that simple, but I think it'll happen. And finally, that mitigating the effects of natural hazards. So it's not just climate change and coastal hazards, but other natural hazards as well. So we're used to that here. You know, our construction design standards, for example, we have very high requirements for seismic resilience that aren't perhaps as strict in other parts that don't get the liquefaction we get here. Transformation is also on the agenda, not when we first go into the new water services entities, if we go after the national elections, so it's all subject to change. But if the water services entities do go ahead, they are wanting to transform the way that we deliver water, and in particular, the Te Mana o Te Wai, which you've probably heard through some of your earlier lectures, getting much better outcomes for the natural environment. So I mentioned the streams on Banks Peninsula, where we have trouble getting enough water in the summer. We suck those streams just about dry at the moment, and we'll never get a resource consent to do that again. Under Te Mana o Te Wai, the health of the stream comes first, and we'll have to leave a decent base flow in those streams, and then the needs of the community come second. So the water supply will take almost all of what's available next, and nobody else will get a look in. But there's a big change coming to protect those natural resources. And there's also opportunities for transformation in terms of smarts in our water network. I mean, we do have some smarts. I talked about the monitoring and control systems that we have, but those smarts are pretty old smarts, to be honest, and we could do a lot more in terms of updating our system. And we do have a pilot out east in the Rafiti zone, which is out in the New Brighton Way, with a smart water network out there. So all smart meters, acoustic meters and across the network to listen for leaks, pressure meters and flow meters right through that network to understand exactly what's going A little bit on the program. So by June this year, there was quite a clear program for the transition to the new water services entity. So we have an investment decision framework. So that's how we decide who gets the investment in the networks. Where are the highest priorities? And one of the concerns for cities such as ours is it might not be us. So some networks are in much worse state than us. So our investment may go down because someone else needs more. A lot of work going into collecting asset information, collating that information, and cleaning up the data. Confirming the system of record, that's just the business systems, and then protocols for staff transition. And they want to do that up front because they don't want to lose staff. So frontline 3 water staff have a guaranteed job. Lift, shift, same location, same pay, same job. So they shouldn't be worried about that. There might be changes in the future, but most of those changes will be more opportunities because the workforce is growing. But they have done that already. Now we're starting to draft our future asset management plans, and the entities themselves through the National Transition Unit are looking at their funding and pricing plans. So how will they charge people who are connected for the water? Will it be through rates and working with the council? Will it be a connection fee? Will it be a connection fee plus a volumetric charge? Almost certainly moving towards that last one because it's a very efficient way of running your network. And then there's a whole lot of work in terms of when we get to the end, actually making that transfer, getting those plans in place, getting those financial systems in place, and making sure that on the day after we transfer, that the water still comes out of that tap and you can still flush that toilet. So there's all these national work streams that I won't really go into, but you can be sure that they're putting a lot of effort. They've put almost $300 million into the transition program last year, this year, next year. So there's a lot of work going on in this space. And I'm happy to answer questions. Any question at all? There's one right down the back as well.
Now, 2 questions, Andy Shand. When I lived in Queen's Avenue, we had one pipe going up the street and only 1 metre at the bottom and 2 houses at the top, and we were big users and our neighbours hardly used any. I'm not sure they bathed, so I'm not sure how we spread the cost. The other one is fluoridation. I notice our council's trying to avoid the issue. I can't see why they can't put fluorine in with the chlorine, because you've got the setup there for chlorine. I'm not sure we needed the chlorine, but I think we do need the fluorine.
Okay. So we often get asked about shared water meters. Where there's a shared water meter, you will not be charged. So you'll pay your rates, but you won't pay a volumetric charge for excess use. But that won't last long, believe me. So we are reading those shared water meters, and where we can see there's 2 houses or 3 houses or 4 houses, if the use goes above the use at which there'd be a charge, we'll go in there and we'll put separate meters in. First, actually, we'll go in there and check that there isn't a leak, because someone might have a leak, and then we'll go in and put separate meters in, so those will be charged eventually. But if you're sharing a meter at the moment, you won't be charged. The second one, fluoride. When you say councillors avoiding fluoride, this is true. The elected councillors have said they don't want fluoride. And that's pretty much a response to the attachment that the people of Christchurch have to their pure, unadulterated water. They don't want anything added to it. Fluoride, chlorine, anything at all. However, it's pretty clear from the evidence that, that fluoride does have population-wide benefits in terms of dental health, and I think eventually this council or the new water services entity will have to add fluoride. It's not easy though. We don't have chlorine dosing at all our pump stations, and we don't have facilities to mix fluoride at all of our pump stations in the way it needs to be mixed before it's added. So the cost to add fluoride is probably somewhere between 50 and 60 million in Christchurch. And so that investment will be will not go ahead really until the Ministry of Health tell us to. That's where it sits at the moment.
Thank you so much, Suzanne Silver. You talked about the water on Banks Peninsula. If, in fact, the streams are to be protected and the water was not going to be available, is there going to be some other way that water is delivered to Banks Peninsula, or do we have to cut the population there?
It's a very good question. We'll probably do both of those things. So one of the issues with very small communities where there are water security issues is, should you allow them to develop? And so the land use planning must take that into account. Can we actually provide both the infrastructure and the water supply in some of these places, and then get rid of the wastewater? For the existing towns over there, I think we probably can, but we do need to reduce the use. So the water use on Banks Peninsula might be less than the water use that's okay in the city, for example. So in the city, the average use in the city is about 420 litres per day. If you go and look at a European city, the average water use in a household is much, much less. It's around 180 to 200. So part of that is because they don't have gardens at all. And part of it is because they're so much more aware. I don't know if you've ever had a Dutchman or someone from Germany come and stay, and you hear them turn the shower on and off. Because, you know, when they're shaving or washing their hair or lathering, they turn it off to save that water. Because every drop costs them, and it costs them a lot. They pay a lot for water in some of those European cities. We don't have that culture at all. You know, we still leave it running when we clean our teeth, or my children do. We just don't have the same culture about how valuable that water is. And we're profligate users, I have to say. And so that will have to change in some of those smaller communities where water is a problem. And the other issue is wastewater as a resource. So in Akaroa, for example, we are putting in a new wastewater plant that will be a very sophisticated plant, and the water coming out of that will be very, very good. And we'll be able to reuse it. And we'll reuse it in irrigating parks and reserves, for example. But what we'd like to do is for the Ministry of Health to get on board and allow us to reuse it for households. So for flushing toilets, for example. So flushing toilets is a complete waste of water. Good, clean, potable water. We should be using something else for that. Or make them use dry composting toilets over in Akaroa. That'd be good.
Nigel Humphreys. Helen, is there any possibility that future developments, that are suburban developments, may be required to have grey water recovery systems in the households for exactly what you talked about, the flushing of toilets?
Yeah, I think that is possible, and I think that'll be done by settlement area. Here in Christchurch, we have so much water, it's just not necessary. So we don't have a water supply problem here. We have a time of use problem, okay? So we've got heaps and heaps of water. It's just the only issue we have is that hot summer day, hot summer afternoon after 2 weeks of dry weather when everybody wants to water their garden. And the use, it doesn't just double, it goes up 4 times. So during the winter, we only use about 1/3 of our wells, and that's plenty. That's plenty for you to wash your dishes, clean your teeth, have a shower, do your laundry, all of those things that the water supply is really for. But when people want to water a vegetable garden, which is fine, but then water their fruit trees, which is probably also fine, you can probably also stay within a reasonable use, but then they want to irrigate the 2 hectares out the back, it rapidly gets very high. So we do have households that use thousands of litres per day in the summer. And those households are putting an incredible burden on everybody else because we have to build a network that supplies that. Otherwise, we risk pressure collapse and people having no water at all in those zones where there's very high use. So, yeah, it's a mix. In small places, grey water recovery is a really good thing. In the city, that's not the answer because it's not the problem. The resource is not the problem. Those aquifers under our city are amazing, absolutely amazing.
Bernadette Ford. I was just wondering, this new Three Waters reform, how does that affect the ownership of the council's assets and the governance? And does the City Council approve of this legislation going forward?
So the council doesn't. I mean, we've got a new council now, but so we'll have to wait and see where they are. But so far, the council has said no. They don't like reform, and they don't like it partly because of the governance arrangements, and partly because it's three waters and not two waters, which I talked a little bit about. In terms of the ownership of the assets stays with the community. So the council technically still owns the assets, but it has no control over them, and nor does it have any control over the investment profile in them. So it's ownership in name only. I think the government's being a bit glib about that, to be honest. But perhaps it doesn't matter, because those assets can only be used to deliver you drinking water and take away your wastewater and deal with the stormwater. They can't actually be used for anything else. And there are very strong controls against privatisation and selling of those assets. Although again, all it takes is a change in government to unpick those controls. So it's an interesting question. Similar reform has taken place in other places. So Scotland is often used as an example. Again, in Scotland, it's two waters rather than three. But Scotland is very similar to New Zealand in terms of wanting those assets to stay in public ownership. And there has been no privatisation there, and nor would privatisation be palatable to the general community, and therefore it's unpalatable to any government that wants to get back in. So I suspect New Zealand would be much the same, that they would stay in public ownership.
Kia ora, Helen. I'm Peter Gordon. Suzanne did take part of my question. I was going to suggest the water that's being or has been sold from out north of the city, that could surely be used for the Banks Peninsula area. Is that a possibility? And secondly, could you clarify the difference between the concept of two waters and that of three waters?
So yes, we could use other water sources for Banks Peninsula, and in fact we have plenty available from our resource consent for taking from the aquifers now. It's quite expensive though to pipe it out there, pump and pipe it, and we generally prefer communities to be self-sufficient within their catchment, and there's two reasons. One, it's cheaper, so it would cost a lot to pipe it out there, and two, it's more resilient. So any long pipelines are subject to breaks, particularly in seismic events. So I personally don't like them. I like a community to be able to look after itself within its own catchment for both water and wastewater. It's not always possible, but it is the preference. But yes, we are looking at alternative sources out on Banks Peninsula, as well as the demand management side and the reuse of wastewater. In terms of the two waters rather than three waters, it's the drinking water and wastewater that are the two services that we see as easy to lift and shift into a separate entity. They are where the public health gains are to be made. They are where the environmental gains are to be made. So the public health gains in water supply and good wastewater management, but the environmental gains in terms of wastewater effluent disposal and improving that, and reducing overflows, so wet weather overflows that we get here in this city and in many other cities. They're also really easy to charge for by connection. Stormwater and floodplain management are much more difficult because they're area-wide. How do you decide someone in the back end of Hornby, how much do you charge them for floodplain protection and stormwater compared to someone in a hole out east? That's really hard, and you've got a pump station and you've got high costs. Do you charge them more and them less, or do you do it through a rating mechanism as we do here, so everybody contributes for the community as a whole? So I think The gains are in the two waters, and the funding and pricing models lend themselves to a separate entity and a separate bill, just like your electricity or your telephone or any other utility. Stormwater is much more difficult. And also stormwater is integrated into our district plan. I don't know if any of you have tried to buy a house or move in recent years, but one of the first things a lot of people do in Christchurch, or ought to do in Christchurch, is look up whether or not it's flood prone. And that'll tell you quite a lot about what the planning rules are around that piece of land, how high you have to build your floor. If you look at new builds out in New Brighton, you'll see some of them are 1.8 metres above the ground now, and that's because of the coastal hazards and the flooding out there. And in other parts of the city, you can't get insurance if your house is an older house and down at a low level and subject to flooding. So, you know, there's real land use rules that go around stormwater and floodplain management that a water services entity won't be interested in, but a council is.
Margaret Austin. So, but I think my questions have more or less been asked. But thank you very much indeed for the presentation that you've given on the background and all of the work that has been done to come up with the proposals that are actually under consideration. But now we're faced with the angst and the almost anger of many of the councils against any reform at all. How are we going to resolve the issues which will allow us now to work towards adopting the either two waters or three waters plan in a progressive and sensible way?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Central government, it's interesting, I'm getting into the political realm here, so I hope there's no reporters in the room. So as a member of staff at council, I provide advice to the councillors, and the councillors make decisions about their response to central government. So I haven't agreed with everything our council said, but I do agree with a lot of it. So I'll just put that rider in. But in terms of what central government has done, I think they've misread the population and their local government partners on Three Waters, and they've tried to push this through very hard, and they've made their case for change, and they've done very good work on making their case for change. There is a case for change. Small communities cannot manage either their water supplies or their wastewater systems. However, they haven't looked at a whole range of options and then been collaborative on how we choose between those range of options and evaluate them, and how do we get the best outcomes for them. Instead, they've picked their winner and said, this is what we're going to do and this is why we're going to do it, and just kept saying that. And I think that's where a lot of the anger has come, that local government, you know, would have been much happier about, these are the range of options, where do you see, you know, the best outcomes? And they just haven't done that. And I think that's what's caused some of the pushback. And that's really what caused the government to, instead of make it an opt-in process, that it would just be mandated, that it'll be compulsory, it'll happen, so you can say what you like, but we're going to do it. And then that's caused the National Party to come out and say, well, have we got a deal for you if you get us in next time? And they've proposed to roll it back, which is ironic because they started the water reform program, so... Yeah, so there's a bit of political work to be done yet, and I suspect that the Labor government may take a step back to think and look at, are there alternative options that would work, and can they get cross-party support and get the National back on board if they make some changes. So I'm quite hopeful that they will do that, because something needs to change. Maybe not the model that we've got, but something needs to change.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question. Thanks.
Well, it's been, Ivor Watson's my name. It's been very informative of you, and I've learned a lot about the three waters that I didn't know. Just tell me if the regions that are proposed for the three waters, as it's presently presented, largely seems to follow Maori tribal land areas. If you were starting without that, would that be a sensible arrangement of territories?
So the only place where it follows the iwi boundaries is actually the South Island. In the North Island it's not so easy because there are multiple iwi and overlapping boundaries in fact. So it's only in the South Island. Is it sensible? I would have just put all of the South Island in, to be honest, and not taken out that small amount of Nelson Marlborough and said, you guys talk to Wellington. But you know, maybe we'll get something along those lines. I don't know. I mean, almost certainly in practice, even if Entity D or the Southern Waters entity doesn't have that area, we will probably end up looking after them because they're our neighbours. And if something happens, they don't want to ring Wellington and say, "Can you send a truck down?" So yeah. I'll come down.
Oh, no, Helen, thank you. I think you have brought... Can you hear me now? Sorry. I think you've brought our series to a very good conclusion. It's been great to hear the Council's perspective on Three Waters. I commend you on your balanced presentation. You have given us a better understanding of the issues. I'm so glad that you've clarified one situation that we've heard so much about, that the government was taking our assets, because that's been a standard argument. And sadly, the media have never managed to get to drill down into that, to give a balanced presentation as you have. So I want to thank you very much. I think it's been invaluable. And I'd like to say that the koha that we generally or always give our presenters, Helen has asked that it go to the City Mission. So thank you very much.